There's a particular kind of satisfaction that comes from finally understanding the exact mechanics of something that used to control you completely. The moment you stop being the person reacting to mind games and start being the person who understands, with total clarity, exactly how the machine works. And once you understand a machine that well, something interesting becomes possible. Not revenge, not cruelty, not becoming someone you're not, but something far more useful: the ability to use the very patterns designed to control you as a tool for your own protection and power instead. Today, we're going to break down exactly how that works, because understanding this isn't about becoming manipulative yourself. It's about finally understanding the game well enough that it stops being able to be played on you at all. Here's what needs to be said clearly before we go any further, because the framing here matters enormously. Turning a narcissist's mind games against them doesn't mean becoming a manipulator yourself, learning their tactics so you can use them the same way they do, trading cruelty for cruelty. That would just make you a different version of the same problem. What we're actually talking about today is something far more powerful and far more ethical: learning to recognize their tactics so precisely, so completely, that instead of those tactics working on you, they start reflecting straight back, exposing exactly what they were always designed to hide. This isn't about becoming someone who plays games. It's about becoming someone the games simply can't be played on anymore, and using that same clarity to interrupt the pattern entirely. So let's walk through exactly how this works, tactic by tactic, because once you understand the specific mechanism behind each one, you'll never be caught off guard by it again, and more importantly, you'll understand exactly how to respond in a way that turns their own strategy back into evidence against them. Let's start with gaslighting, because this is probably the single most disorienting tactic in the entire narcissistic playbook, and also one of the most powerful to learn to redirect. Gaslighting works by exploiting a very specific vulnerability: your natural tendency to trust another person's confident assertion over your own less certain memory, especially when that person seems so genuinely convinced of their version of events. The typical response to gaslighting, and the one that keeps you trapped in it, is trying to prove your version of reality, arguing harder, producing more evidence, escalating your own certainty to match theirs. Here's what almost nobody tells you about why that approach fails so consistently. You're not actually in a debate about facts. You're in a battle over whose confidence wins. And a narcissist has spent years perfecting confident delivery, regardless of whether what they're saying is true. Trying to out-argue that confidence with facts alone rarely works, because facts were never actually what was winning the exchange in the first place. So how do you turn this specific tactic against them instead of getting pulled into the losing game of proving your reality? You stop supplying the thing gaslighting depends on entirely: your emotional investment in convincing them. Instead of arguing your version of events, you simply, calmly state what you know to be true once, clearly, without escalating, without pleading for them to acknowledge it, and then you let the conversation end there. Something remarkable happens when you do this consistently. Gaslighting depends on your visible confusion, your visible doubt, your visible need for their validation of reality. When you remove all of that, when you simply state your truth and stop needing them to agree with it, the tactic has nothing left to grip onto. And here's the part that turns it back against them specifically: your calm, unshaken certainty, especially over time, especially witnessed by other people, starts to make their increasingly desperate insistence look exactly like what it is: someone working very hard to convince everyone of something that isn't holding up under simple, steady scrutiny. The more they escalate, trying to win back the doubt they used to create so effortlessly, the more visible their own desperation becomes. Now let's talk about triangulation, the tactic where a narcissist brings a third person into the dynamic: an ex, a friend, a family member, sometimes even a stranger, specifically to generate jealousy, insecurity, or a sense of competition that keeps you anxiously trying to earn back attention that was never actually at risk of leaving in the first place. This tactic works by hijacking a very natural human instinct: the desire to feel chosen, to feel like the priority, and using the threat of losing that position to keep you compliant, anxious, and working harder to secure something that was designed to always feel slightly out of reach. Here's how you turn triangulation back against them. The typical trapped response is to compete, to try harder, to become more impressive, more available, more accommodating than whoever's been positioned as the threat. This response is exactly what keeps the tactic working because it proves the strategy is effective. Instead, the move that actually disarms this tactic entirely is genuine, visible indifference to the comparison itself. Not performed indifference designed to provoke a reaction, which is just another version of playing the same game, but real, grounded indifference that comes from understanding something crucial. If someone needs to manufacture competition to maintain your interest, that manufactured competition was never actually about the other person at all. It was always simply a tool, and tools only work if you engage with them as though they're real threats. The moment you stop treating the triangulation as information about your own value and start treating it as information about their own insecurity and need for control, the tool stops functioning, and something interesting happens. The narcissist, who was counting on your anxious competing, is left holding a tactic that produced no reaction at all, and that lack of reaction, over time, becomes its own kind of exposure, because it reveals just how much the entire dynamic depended on your participation to function. Let's talk about the silent treatment next, one of the most psychologically punishing tactics in the entire arsenal, because it exploits something deep in human wiring, the fear of social exclusion, of abandonment, of being cut off from connection as punishment for behavior the narcissist has deemed unacceptable. The typical trapped response here is desperate pursuit, apologizing even when you haven't done anything wrong, reaching out repeatedly, trying every possible angle to restore connection, because the silence itself feels unbearable, and the anxiety it produces genuinely does feel, physiologically, like a threat to your safety. Here's how you turn the silent treatment back against them. You simply let it be silent, genuinely, without secretly checking your phone every few minutes, without composing apologetic messages in your head that you're just waiting for the right moment to send. You use that time instead for yourself completely. And here's the part that reveals something crucial about this tactic once you stop feeding it your anxiety. The silent treatment was never actually meant to be a genuine break from the relationship. It was meant to be a controlled punishment, one they fully intended to end on their own timeline, once they'd extracted enough anxious pursuit from you to feel like the power balance had been restored. When you don't provide that anxious pursuit, when the silence genuinely doesn't destabilize you the way it's designed to, the tactic loses its entire function, and often you'll notice something telling happen. The silence ends far faster than it used to, because maintaining a punishment that isn't generating any visible suffering isn't actually satisfying for the person deploying it. Their own silence becomes evidence of exactly what it was always meant to be, a controlled tool rather than genuine emotional need for space, revealed the moment it stops producing the reaction it was built to extract. Now let's talk about love bombing, the tactic most people associate with the very beginning of a relationship, but one that often resurfaces later too, especially after conflict, deployed specifically to override doubt with an overwhelming display of affection, attention, and generosity. This tactic works by exploiting the natural human tendency to interpret intensity as depth, to assume that grand gestures must indicate grand feeling, when in reality, intensity and genuine commitment are often almost entirely unrelated to each other. Here's how you turn love bombing back against them. Instead of receiving the intensity as proof of devotion, you simply, calmly observe it as data, and specifically, you watch for consistency rather than intensity. You stop asking, how intensely do they seem to feel this right now? And start asking, how consistently has their behavior matched their words over meaningful stretches of time? This single shift from being moved by intensity to being informed by consistency is one of the most powerful tools available for disarming love bombing entirely, because it means the tactic simply stops having the effect it's designed to have. And here's what happens when you consistently respond this way, instead of getting swept up in the grand gesture. The narcissist, whose love bombing depends on generating an emotional high that overrides your rational assessment, finds that assessment simply isn't getting overridden anymore. The gesture, however impressive, gets met with calm observation rather than swept-up gratitude, and over time, this forces something revealing to happen. Either the intensity has to keep escalating to try to produce the same effect, which starts to look increasingly desperate and unsustainable, or it simply stops, because maintaining an expensive performance that isn't achieving its intended result eventually isn't worth the effort anymore. And this brings us to something crucial that ties all four of these tactics together, something that explains why turning each individual mind game back against a narcissist works so consistently, regardless of which specific tactic they're deploying. And understanding this underlying principle is going to completely change how you approach every single interaction going forward, because it's the master key underneath everything we've walked through today. That's exactly where we're going next. That underlying principle, the one tying together every single tactic we've walked through today, comes down to something so simple it almost feels anticlimactic once you name it directly, but its simplicity is exactly what makes it so powerful. Every single mind game a narcissist deploys depends entirely on your participation to function. Not your love, not your loyalty, not your genuine investment in the relationship, specifically your participation, your visible reaction, your emotional engagement with the tactic itself. Remove that participation, and the tactic doesn't just fail, it reverses, because a strategy that requires your reaction to succeed becomes, in the absence of that reaction, undeniable evidence of exactly what it always was, an attempt at control, rather than a genuine expression of anything real. This is why every single technique we've covered today, refusing to argue reality during gaslighting, refusing to compete during triangulation, refusing to chase during the silent treatment, refusing to be swept up during love bombing, works through the same underlying mechanism. You're not learning new manipulative tactics of your own. You're simply withdrawing the fuel that every single manipulative tactic requires to keep running. And here's what makes this so much more powerful than trying to fight manipulation with manipulation of your own. When you stop participating in the game entirely, you're not just protecting yourself from that specific tactic in that specific moment. You're demonstrating clearly and undeniably exactly what the tactic actually was, both to yourself and often to anyone else who happens to be watching the pattern unfold. Now, I want to talk about something crucial here, because understanding these mechanisms intellectually and actually holding your ground when they're deployed against you in real time are two very different challenges, and I don't want to pretend this is simple just because it's straightforward to explain. The reason these tactics work so well in the first place is because they're specifically designed to trigger deep, often subconscious fears. Fear of not being believed, fear of losing connection, fear of abandonment, fear of missing out on something real. Overriding those fears requires more than just intellectual understanding. It requires practice, repetition, and often real support outside the relationship itself. Because trying to hold this kind of steady, unreactive ground entirely alone, without any outside perspective to confirm what you're seeing, is exponentially harder than doing it with even one trusted person who can reflect reality back to you when the narcissist is working hard to distort it. I also want to address something important about timing and safety here, because turning these tactics back against a narcissist isn't something you flip on overnight through sheer willpower, and attempting to do so too abruptly, especially in a relationship where there's any element of volatility or unpredictability, deserves real caution. Narcissists who sense their usual tools failing don't always respond with quiet defeat. Sometimes, as we've discussed in other conversations, they escalate, they search harder for new angles, they occasionally become more volatile before they become less effective. If you're in a situation where escalation could mean real risk to your safety, emotional or physical, this entire framework needs to be approached with a safety plan first, ideally with the input of a therapist or domestic violence resource who understands the specific dynamics of your situation, rather than attempted in isolation as a purely strategic exercise. For situations where safety isn't an acute concern, where you're simply dealing with the exhausting, disorienting experience of navigating mind games in a relationship, family dynamic, or workplace situation, I want to leave you with something practical to carry forward from everything we've covered today. The next time you feel a mind game starting to work on you, the confusion of gaslighting, the anxiety of triangulation, the desperation of the silent treatment, the swept-up feeling of love bombing, I want you to pause and ask yourself one specific question before you react. What does my reaction right now give them? Because once you can identify exactly what your reaction is providing, confirmation of their reality, evidence of your anxious investment, proof that the silence worked, validation that the grand gesture succeeded, you gain the ability to choose, deliberately, whether to keep providing it. And here's what I want you to understand about what happens once you consistently choose not to. This isn't about winning some elaborate psychological chess match against them. Though there's a certain satisfaction in watching tactics that used to control you completely simply stop working. It's about something much more important than winning. It's about finally, completely reclaiming your own perception, your own emotional responses, your own sense of what's real, from someone who spent a long time convincing you that all of it belonged to them instead. Every single time you recognize a tactic instead of falling into it, you're not just protecting yourself from that specific manipulation. You're rebuilding trust in your own mind, one interaction at a time, until eventually, the mind games that used to feel so powerful, so disorienting, so impossible to see clearly while you were inside them, become something you can watch unfold with almost clinical detachment, recognizable from the very first move, powerless against someone who finally understands exactly how the entire mechanism works. If this gave you a genuinely useful way to protect yourself the next time you find yourself facing one of these tactics, know that you're far from the only one learning to navigate this, and there's a lot more we can work through together as we go. Make sure you're subscribed, because we go deeper into this every single week.